Welcome back to Boring History for Sleep, where the candles flicker, the kings regret everything, and you're already too deep to stop now. You didn't just welcome the blade, you invited it in, knelt beneath it, and whispered, Amen. If these stories have helped you drift into quieter dreams, thank you. Like, subscribe, and tell me, where are you listening from and what hour does sleep find you? Tonight, you smile through incense and hymns, cradle a kingdom in ceremony, and erase a saint while the bells still echo. Close your eyes. Feel the weight of your body sinking into the bed, the hush between breaths, the stillness of warm sheets and the gentle drag of gravity. The sound of this voice slower now, as if it's been here before, as if you have. And somewhere, behind your eyelids, the stone walls rise. The chapel glows in candlelight. Blood stains the floor beneath the altar, and no one dares to clean it. Perfume clings to the robes of men who claim to mourn. There's gold on the tomb, coins in the box, and stories in every whispered prayer. A priest is dead, a saint is born, and somewhere in the dream, you're the one who lit the candle. Not to see, but to watch it burn. The monks of Canterbury Cathedral discovered something remarkable in the hours after Thomas Becket's murder. Death, it turned out, was an excellent career move. The Archbishop, who had been a political nightmare while breathing, was becoming a spiritual goldmine while cooling on the cathedral floor, his blood still tacky on the stones like divine adhesive. The transformation began almost immediately, with the kind of efficiency that would have impressed even Thomas's Chancellor Syria administrative skills. Within hours of the murder, people were reporting miracles. A woman with a persistent cough touched a blood-stained stone and suddenly breathed freely. A man with a limp dipped his finger in the pooling blood and walked straight. A child with poor vision looked upon the murdered archbishop and saw clearly, though what he saw was probably quite disturbing. The monks, displaying the kind of entrepreneurial spirit that made medieval Christianity so fascinating, immediately recognized opportunity when it was bleeding on their floor. They began collecting every drop of blood, every fragment of brain matter, every thread from Thomas's vestments. Nothing was too small, too gore-soaked, or too theologically questionable to become a potential relic. The blood collection process was particularly creative. The monks diluted Thomas's blood with water, creating what they called the water of St. Thomas. This had the dual benefit of making the blood last longer and making it less viscous, which was important for distribution purposes. The fact that they were essentially creating medieval homeopathy didn't seem to bother anyone. A drop of Thomas's blood in a bucket of water was still Thomas's blood, at least according to the kind of mathematics that made transubstantiation work. Friar William, showing administrative skills that Thomas would have appreciated, organized the relic production with assembly line efficiency. Monks were assigned to blood collection, others to fabric preservation, and a special team to document miracles. Within days, Canterbury Cathedral had transformed from crime scene to sacred site, from place of murder to source of miracles. The speed of miracle reports was remarkable. Word spread through Canterbury, then Kent, then all of England with the velocity of scandal mixed with salvation. People who had never shown interest in Thomas while he lived suddenly discovered deep devotion to him dead. Ailments that had persisted for years vanished at the touch of a blood-stained cloth. Demons fled at the mention of his name. Even animals, apparently, were healed by proximity to Becket's materials. The pilgrims began arriving before the funeral arrangements were complete. They came on foot, on horseback, on hands and knees. They brought sick children, twisted limbs, clouded eyes, and troubled souls. Most importantly, they brought money, offerings poured in with the kind of abundance that made the monks wonder if perhaps they should have martyred their archbishop sooner. The miracle verification process was surprisingly rigorous for an age not known for scientific method. Witnesses were interviewed, symptoms were documented, cures were certified. The monks understood that credibility was important. Too many dubious miracles would devalue the authentic ones. They needed quality control for their quality saint. One of the earliest and most dramatic miracles involved a knight who had been struck blind, supposedly for speaking ill of Thomas. He arrived at Canterbury led by his squire, stumbling and weeping. After praying at the site of Thomas's murder and being touched with a cloth soaked in the diluted blood, his sight returned instantly. He could see clearly enough to count the coins he then donated to the cathedral, which was convenient for everyone involved. The merchants of Canterbury adapted to the new economy with remarkable speed. Suddenly, every shop sold pilgrim badges, miniature ampullae for holy water, and guidebooks to the murder site. Inns that had been struggling filled with pilgrims. Food vendors discovered that bread blessed by proximity to Thomas's tomb could be sold for twice the normal price. It was capitalism with a sacred veneer, which was the best kind of medieval capitalism. The blood itself became the star attraction. The monks had created an endless supply through careful dilution, and each drop was treated as precious beyond measure. Pilgrims would wait hours for the chance to touch a cloth that had touched a cloth that had touched the blood. The degrees of separation didn't seem to diminish the effect. Thomas's blood, like his influence, apparently transcended normal limitations. The cathedral floor where Thomas had died became particularly sacred. Pilgrims would prostrate themselves on the exact spot, kissing stones still stained with archiepiscopal blood. Some tried to chip away fragments of the floor itself, forcing the monks to post guards. You couldn't have pilgrims dismantling the cathedral stone by stone, no matter how holy their intentions. Medical miracles were the most popular and the most documented. A catalogue began to be compiled. Paralytics walked, the blind saw, the deaf heard, the mute spoke. Tumours vanished, fevers broke, wounds healed. The variety was impressive, suggesting either that Thomas's blood was a universal panacea or that medieval diagnostic techniques were highly creative. But it wasn't just physical ailments. Mental afflictions were also cured. The possessed were exorcised, the melancholic cheered, the mad restored to sanity. One woman claimed that touching Thomas's blood had cured her of excessive gossiping, though witnesses suggested the cure was temporary. Another man insisted that proximity to the tomb had ended his compulsive gambling, though he was later seen wagering on how many miracles would occur that week. The theological implications were staggering. Here was proof that Thomas had been right all along. God was clearly on his side, posthumously. Every miracle was a divine vindication, every healing a heavenly vote of confidence. The Archbishop, who had been so troublesome in life, was proving even more troublesome in death, but in ways that benefited everyone except those who had opposed him. Henry II, receiving reports of the miraculous activities in Canterbury, developed what courtiers described as a fixed expression of royal discomfort. It's difficult to maintain you are justified in your anger when the target of that anger is busy curing lepers and restoring sight to the blind. Every miracle was an accusation, every healing a reproach. The Pope, Alexander III, watched developments with interest and satisfaction. The Becket situation, which had been such a headache while Thomas lived, was resolving itself beautifully with him dead. Martyrs were so much easier to manage than living archbishops. They didn't write angry letters, demand jurisdiction, or threaten interdicts. They just performed miracles and enhanced papal prestige. The canonization process began informally the moment Thomas died, and formally as soon as the paperwork could be arranged. Investigators were dispatched to verify miracles, interview witnesses, and compile evidence. The case was overwhelming. Thomas Becket wasn't just saint material, he was premium grade, top shelf, instant sanctity. By early 1171, barely a year after the murder, the cult of Thomas Becket was established, organised, and thriving. Canterbury had become the most important pilgrimage site in England, competing with established shrines across Europe. The cathedral that had witnessed murder was now witnessing an endless stream of miracles, pilgrims, and prophets. The blood hadn't dried yet, literally or figuratively. Fresh miracles were reported daily, new pilgrims arrived hourly. The transformation of Thomas from political problem to spiritual solution was complete, accomplished with a speed that would have impressed even medieval efficiency experts. But this was just the beginning. The cult of St. Thomas would grow, elaborate, and eventually attract the attention of kings who thought they could control sanctity as easily as they controlled nations. They would learn, as Henry II was already learning, that dead saints were often more powerful than living archbishops and infinitely more difficult to argue with. Henry II spent the first years after Thomas's murder in what could charitably be called damage control mode, and more accurately called trying not to look like a saint killer while ruling an empire. The Angevin Empire, stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees, required constant attention, but everywhere Henry went, the shadow of Canterbury followed like a particularly persistent cloud of disapproval. The initial reaction to news of the murder had been carefully managed. Henry, in Normandy when word arrived, performed shock and grief with the dedication of a method actor. He withdrew from public view, refused food, wore sackcloth, and generally behaved like a man surprised by an outcome everyone else had seen coming. Whether the grief was genuine or political theatre remains debatable. Probably it was both, since medieval emotions, like medieval politics, rarely came in pure forms. But performed grief only worked for so long. The Pope, while stopping short of immediate excommunication, made it clear that some form of penance would be required. Other European monarchs, delighted to have moral superiority over the powerful Henry, made concerned noises that managed to sound both sympathetic and accusatory. The King of France was particularly vocal in his shock, managing to imply that this was what came of English barbarism, without quite saying it outright. The real problem was the miracles. Every reported healing at Canterbury was a reminder of Henry's role in creating the martyr. It's hard to maintain you were justified when your victim is busy curing the sick from beyond the grave. Henry tried various approaches, ignoring the miracles, questioning their authenticity, suggesting natural explanations. None worked. The medieval public loved a good miracle, and Thomas was providing them with theatrical regularity. By 1172, Henry attempted his first reconciliation with the Church. He met with papal legates at Avranches, where he swore he hadn't ordered Thomas's death. Technically true if you passed, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" as a rhetorical question rather than a command. He agreed to various penances, to take the cross and go on crusade, eventually, to restore church properties, to abandon the constitutions of Clarendon that had started the whole mess. But it wasn't enough. The cult of St. Thomas continued to grow, and with it the implicit condemnation of Henry. Every pilgrim walking to Canterbury was walking away from royal authority. Every miracle was a reminder that God, apparently, had been on Thomas's side. Henry needed something more dramatic, more public, more humiliating. He needed to crawl. The opportunity came in 1174 during one of the many rebellions that plagued Henry's later reign. His sons, displaying the family talent for dysfunction, had risen against him, supported by the King of France and various disgruntled barons. The rebellion was going badly for Henry when he decided that divine intervention, or at least the appearance of it, might help. On July 12, 1174, Henry arrived at Canterbury as a penitent. He had walked the last 3 miles barefoot, which on medieval roads was less symbolic suffering and more actual torture. He wore a hair shirt, that medieval garment designed to make comfort impossible and sanctity itchy. He looked, in short, like a man who had discovered that being king was less fun when saints held grudges. The scene at the cathedral was carefully choreographed. Henry entered not as a king, but as a sinner. He prostrated himself before Thomas's tomb, which by now was surrounded by the detritus of devotion, candles, offerings, and the occasional abandoned crutch from successful healings. He wept, though whether from emotion, political calculation, or the pain in his feet was unclear. Then came the main event, the scourging. Henry submitted to being whipped by the monks of Canterbury, receiving 5 lashes from each bishop present and 3 from each of the 80 monks. The mathematics of penance meant Henry received over 250 strokes, though presumably they varied in enthusiasm. Some monks probably put their backs into it, remembering Thomas. Others might have whipped gently, remembering that this was still the king. The scourging was public, visible, and extremely memorable. Henry, the most powerful man in Europe, was being beaten by monks in the cathedral where his knights had murdered their archbishop. It was political theatre of the highest order, humiliation transformed into healing. Every stroke was an admission of guilt, every welt a plea for forgiveness. But Henry, even in penance, remained politically astute. He timed his humiliation perfectly. The next day, news arrived that William the Lion of Scotland, one of the rebellion's key supporters, had been captured. It was presented as a miracle, divine approval of Henry's penance. God apparently accepted the king's apology and rewarded it with military victory. The rebellion collapsed, Henry's position was secured, and everyone agreed that public flogging was a small price to pay for divine favour and political stability. The penance at Canterbury became the defining image of Henry's relationship with the church post-Becket. Here was a king humble enough to be beaten, wise enough to know when crawling was better than standing. It was humiliating, but it was also brilliant. Henry had transformed himself from saint-killer to penitent, from oppressor to pilgrim. The Pope, informed of Henry's spectacular submission, was satisfied. The formal reconciliation was complete. Henry was fully restored to the Church's good graces, the interdicts were lifted, and everyone could pretend that the unfortunate Becket incident was resolved. The fact that Thomas continued performing miracles from his tomb was politely ignored in official correspondence. But the psychological impact on Henry was lasting. Contemporary chroniclers noted changes in the king after Canterbury. He was less quick to anger, more careful in his relations with the Church, and definitely more cautious about rhetorical questions in the presence of armed knights. The hair shirt, some claimed, became a regular part of his wardrobe, though hidden under royal robes. The penance also established a precedent. Future English kings would learn that challenging the Church too directly could lead to barefoot walks and public beatings. The balance of power between Crown and Church had been dramatically illustrated on the floor of Canterbury Cathedral, first with Thomas's blood, then with Henry's submission. For the cult of St. Thomas, Henry's penance was the ultimate vindication. The king who had caused the martyrdom had admitted his guilt in the most public way possible. Every future miracle could be seen in the light of Henry's submission. Thomas had won the argument, even if he'd had to die to do it. The economic impact was immediate. Pilgrimage to Canterbury increased dramatically after 1174. If the king himself had walked barefoot to the shrine, surely common people could manage the journey. The roads to Canterbury became highways of devotion, worn smooth by millions of feet following in Henry's reluctant footsteps. Henry lived another 15 years after his penance, ruling his empire with diminished enthusiasm and increasing weariness. He never returned to Canterbury, perhaps feeling that one barefoot visit was sufficient, but the image of the king on his knees, being whipped by monks, remained. It was reproduced in manuscripts, carved in churches, and remembered in sermons. The crawling back was complete, but the consequences continued. Henry had sought forgiveness and received it, but forgiveness didn't erase memory. He remained the king who had caused a saint's martyrdom, who had challenged God and lost, who had learned that some powers were greater than crowns. Thomas, dead in his tomb, had achieved what he never could alive, the complete submission of his king. It had required martyrdom, miracles, and a public flogging, but the troublesome priest had finally gotten the last word, or rather, the last lash. By the end of the 12th century, Canterbury had transformed from a respectable cathedral city into the Las Vegas of medieval pilgrimage, minus the slot machines but with comparable crowds and considerably more claims of divine intervention. The streets that had once carried normal medieval traffic, merchants, livestock, and the occasional knight looking for someone to fight, now groaned under the weight of humanity seeking salvation, healing, or at least a good story to tell back home. The pilgrimage industry, because that's what it had become, operated with remarkable efficiency. The route from London to Canterbury, roughly 60 miles of medieval road, became as well worn as a merchant's lie. Inns sprang up at convenient intervals, each claiming some connection to St. Thomas. Becket slept here became the medieval equivalent of a 5-star review, though given that Becket had been dead for years, the claims were theologically questionable. The demographics of pilgrims were wonderfully diverse. Noble ladies travelled in cushioned litters, their pilgrimage combining devotion with shopping opportunities. Knights came seeking forgiveness for various violent indiscretions. Their armour traded for pilgrim robes that fooled nobody. Merchants combined business with blessing, making deals while making devotions. And the common people came in droves, walking, limping, crawling, each carrying hopes as heavy as their travel packs. The economics were staggering. A conservative estimate suggested that Canterbury was receiving over 100,000 pilgrims annually by 1200. Each pilgrim needed food, lodging, and souvenirs. The cathedral alone was taking in revenues that would have made Thomas, in his chancellor days, whistle with appreciation. The monks, who had taken vows of poverty, found themselves managing wealth that required increasingly creative theological justifications. The souvenir trade deserves special mention. Pilgrim badges, small lead or pewter pins showing Thomas's martyrdom, were mass-produced with medieval efficiency. These badges served multiple purposes: proof of pilgrimage, protective amulets, and fashion statements. The designs varied from simple mitres to elaborate death scenes, because nothing said, "Oh, I've been on a spiritual journey," like wearing a tiny murdered archbishop on your cloak. But the real money was in the water of St. Thomas. The monks had perfected the dilution process to an art form. A single drop of the martyr's blood, mixed with a barrel of water, could produce hundreds of ampullae. These small lead bottles, sealed with the cathedral's mark, sold for prices that varied based on the pilgrims' apparent wealth and desperation. The monks became expert at assessing both with a glance. The miracle industry operated alongside the souvenir trade with similar efficiency. Pilgrims who experienced healing were encouraged to leave offerings proportional to their cure. A minor headache cure might warrant a few pennies. Major healings, restored sight, straightened limbs, exorcised demons, commanded more substantial donations. Some pilgrims, cured of poverty-inducing illnesses, found themselves impoverished by gratitude instead. The cathedral developed a sophisticated system for managing pilgrim flow. Different entrances for different social classes prevented unfortunate mingling. Special viewing times were arranged for those who could afford privacy. The actual tomb was accessible in degrees. The closer you got, the more it cost. Democracy was a fine concept, but this was medieval England, where even miracles had a price structure. The accommodations industry bloomed like particularly profitable weeds. Every house in Canterbury seemed to sprout an extra room for pilgrims. Quality varied dramatically. Noble pilgrims could find lodgings that rivaled their homes, complete with feather beds and wine that didn't taste of vinegar. Common pilgrims made do with straw, fleas, and the company of fellow seekers who hadn't bathed since beginning their journey. Food vendors discovered that pilgrims were a captive market with limited options and unlimited optimism. Bread that would have been rejected by prisoners sold briskly to pilgrims. Ale that was mostly water with delusions of fermentation found eager buyers. And everything could be improved by claiming it had been blessed near Thomas's tomb. Blessed bread, blessed ale, blessed cheese that smelled suspicious but surely couldn't harm someone on sacred business. The medical tourism aspect was particularly sophisticated. Canterbury developed a reputation for specific cures. Blindness and lameness were specialties, but the tomb also handled demonic possession, mysterious swellings, and the ever-popular general malaise. Some pilgrims arrived with illnesses that seemed to have been carefully cultivated for maximum dramatic impact. The cure rate was impressive, though skeptics noted that many ailments seemed to improve with rest, regular meals, and distance from whatever was causing stress at home. The miracle recording system became increasingly bureaucratic. Monks were assigned to interview the healed, document symptoms, and verify cures. The records read like medical journals written by people who believed in four humours and thought demons caused indigestion. But within the theological framework, they were remarkably thorough. Names, dates, symptoms, and cures were all carefully noted, creating a database of divine intervention. Entertainment wasn't forgotten. Pilgrims needed diversion between prayers, and Canterbury provided. Minstrels sang tales of Thomas's life, death, and posthumous activities. Mystery plays reenacted the martyrdom with varying degrees of accuracy and enthusiasm. Taverns offered specially themed drinks like Becket's Blood, red wine with pretensions, and Archbishop's Agony, something clear that burned. The criminal element, always entrepreneurial, adapted to the new economy. Pickpockets worked the crowds with fingers blessed by practice rather than priests. Fraudulent relic-sellers offered genuine pieces of Thomas's vestments that, if assembled, would have created a wardrobe larger than any archbishop had ever owned. Fake miracle workers staged elaborate healings to prime the pump of genuine belief. The monks tried to police these activities, but controlling crime in a city flooded with hopeful pilgrims was like trying to dam a river with good intentions. Geoffrey Chaucer, writing 2 centuries later, captured the carnival atmosphere perfectly in his Canterbury Tales. His pilgrims, the bawdy wife of Bath, the corrupt pardoner, the noble knight, represented the full spectrum of medieval society, united in journey if not in purpose. They told stories, shared meals, and occasionally remembered they were on sacred business. It was pilgrimage as social event, spiritual journey as group therapy. But beneath the commerce and comedy was genuine faith. Many pilgrims arrived with real suffering. and left with real relief, whether divinely inspired or psychologically induced. The journey itself, the physical hardship, the shared purpose, the break from routine, had therapeutic value, and for those who believed, truly believed, the presence of St. Thomas was palpable, his intervention real, his mercy tangible. The economic impact extended far beyond Canterbury. The pilgrimage routes created their own economies. Towns that happened to lie on the path prospered. Bridges were built, roads improved, and facilities created to handle the flow of faithful feet. England was being physically reshaped by the dead Archbishop's drawing power. By 1200, the cult of St. Thomas had become one of England's major industries. It employed thousands directly and influenced thousands more. It generated revenues that funded building projects, supported charity, and occasionally found their way into less sacred pockets. It was capitalism and faith intertwined so thoroughly that separating them would have been like trying to extract wine from bread after transubstantiation. The success created its own problems. Other shrines looked at Canterbury's profits with holy envy. Competition developed, with various saints' promoters highlighting their particular specialities. But Thomas remained supreme in England, his combination of political martyrdom and miraculous intervention proving irresistible to pilgrims seeking both spiritual and temporal solutions. The pilgrimage to Canterbury had become a defining feature of English Christianity. It was journey as transformation, commerce as devotion, profit as piety, and at the centre of it all lay Thomas Becket, generating more activity dead than he ever had alive, proving that in medieval England, the best career move might be martyrdom, provided you could arrange the right kind of death and ensure proper marketing afterward. The year 1220 marked a significant upgrade in Thomas Becket's posthumous accommodations. After 50 years of performing miracles from what was essentially a temporary tomb, the saint was finally getting housing befitting his status as England's premier supernatural problem solver. The translation of his remains to a new shrine was an event that combined religious ceremony, political theatre, and interior decorating on a budget that would have made living archbishops weep with envy. The preparations had been years in the making. The monks of Canterbury, flush with pilgrimage profits, had commissioned a shrine that would make other saints' tombs look like garden sheds. The design brief was simple: create something so magnificent that pilgrims would be stunned into generosity before they even reached the donation boxes. The craftsman, understanding the assignment, created a monument to excess that would have made Thomas's chancellery wardrobe look restrained. The new shrine was positioned in Trinity Chapel, behind the high altar, in prime spiritual real estate. The location was perfect, visible enough to draw crowds, elevated enough to inspire awe, and conveniently located near multiple donation points. The architects had thought of everything, including crowd flow, acoustic properties for miracle announcements, and strategic placement of windows to create divine lighting effects at profitable times of day. The base of the shrine was marble, carved with scenes from Thomas's life and death. The martyrdom scene was particularly detailed, with tiny knights wielding tiny swords against a serene Thomas. It was historical accuracy meets devotional art, with enough gold leaf to suggest that holiness came with a significant materials budget. The craftsmanship was exquisite, each detail designed to tell the story while encouraging offerings. Above the base rose the shrine proper, a wooden structure covered in gold and silver plates. But this wasn't just metalwork, it was a jeweler's fever dream made manifest. Precious stones covered every available surface, rubies like drops of blood, sapphires like fragments of heaven, emeralds like hopes crystallized. The gems weren't merely decorative, many were offerings from grateful pilgrims, embedded in the shrine like receipts for answered prayers. The most spectacular jewel was the Regale of France, a ruby the size of a hen's egg donated by King Louis VII. It occupied pride of place, catching light and throwing red reflections that looked suspiciously like blood. Other royal donations competed for attention: gems from Henry II, gilt offerings, jewels from Richard the Lionheart, probably stolen from somewhere, and contributions from every monarch who understood that saint snubbing was politically unwise. The translation ceremony itself was a masterpiece of medieval event planning. July 7, 1220 was declared a feast day, with enough advance notice for every inn within 50 miles to raise prices. Stephen Langton, the current Archbishop of Canterbury, presided with the kind of elaborate ceremony that justified the church's investment in vestments. The young King Henry III attended, providing royal legitimacy and ensuring aristocratic attendance. The procession that carried Thomas's remains from the crypt to the new shrine was choreographed like a coronation. Bishops in full regalia, abbots trying to look humble while wearing gold, monks singing harmonies that had been rehearsed to perfection. The remains themselves were in a chest that managed to be both simple, honouring Thomas's late life asceticism, and elaborate, honouring the church's commitment to visual impact. The crowd was enormous, combining invited dignitaries with uninvited masses who'd walked for days to witness the spectacle. The cathedral, large as it was, couldn't accommodate everyone. People climbed pillars, perched on tombs, and stood on each other's shoulders. Several miracles were reported during the ceremony itself, though given the crush, some might have been medical emergencies misinterpreted. As the remains were placed in the new shrine, a collective gasp went through the crowd. The shrine didn't just shimmer, it blazed with reflected light. Every surface caught and threw back illumination, creating an effect that was part disco ball, part divine manifestation. Pilgrims fell to their knees, whether from devotion or simply being overwhelmed by the bling. The economic impact was immediate. Pilgrims who thought they'd seen everything at the old tomb discovered new reasons to be impressed. Offerings increased dramatically. The monks installed collection boxes at strategic points, understanding that ore was most profitable when immediately monetized. Some pilgrims gave everything they had, reasoning that impoverishment in the presence of such holiness was better than comfort elsewhere. The shrine quickly developed its own mythology. The gems were said to glow when miracles were about to occur, the gold supposedly never tarnished, proof of divine favour. The whole structure was rumoured to be impossible to damage, though the monks discouraged experimental verification. Every aspect was invested with meaning, turning decorative choices into theological statements. The security arrangements were elaborate and necessary. That much portable wealth required protection from both casual pilgrims with sticky fingers and organised thieves with crowbars. Guards were posted, though they were called shrine keepers to maintain the religious atmosphere. The shrine was covered with a wooden canopy when not being viewed, partly for protection and partly to create anticipation for the scheduled revelations. The viewing schedule was precisely regulated. Common pilgrims got brief glimpses during specific hours. Wealthy pilgrims could arrange private viewings for appropriate donations. The most generous could even touch the shrine, though only with supervised hands, and hearts presumably pure. It was graduated access to the divine, with price points for every budget. The artistic influence of the shrine spread throughout England. Churches commissioned copies, though none could match the original's splendour. Manuscript illuminations featured it prominently, usually with more jewels than anatomically possible. Even secular buildings began incorporating shrine-inspired elements, as if proximity to the aesthetic might confer some benefits. But the shrine was more than just an artistic achievement. It was a political statement written in gems and gold. Every jewel declared that Thomas had won his argument with royal power. Every pilgrim who knelt before it acknowledged ecclesiastical authority. The shrine didn't just house a saint, it embodied a principle that spiritual power could outshine temporal authority, especially when properly decorated. Kings made obligatory visits, each adding their own jewels to the collection. It became a requirement of English kingship. You weren't properly crowned until you'd knelt at Becket's shrine and left something expensive. Some kings gave grudgingly, others generously, but all gave. The shrine had become part of the royal circuit, a necessary stop on the journey of legitimacy. Foreign dignitaries included Canterbury in their English tours. The shrine became a diplomatic destination, where international relations were conducted against a backdrop of overwhelming sanctity and wealth. Treaties were sworn before it, alliances blessed near it, and everyone pretended not to calculate its cash value while being very impressed by exactly that. The maintenance was constant and expensive. Gems needed polishing, gold required cleaning, and the whole structure needed regular inspection for wear or theft. A staff of specialists tended the shrine like a particularly demanding patient. They developed expertise in everything from jewel setting to crowd control, creating a medieval facility management system. The shrine's influence on Canterbury's architecture was profound. the entire east end of the cathedral was redesigned to showcase it properly. Windows were placed to create optimal lighting, floors were laid to direct pilgrim traffic. Even the ceiling was decorated to complement the shrine's splendour. The building became a setting for its jewel, architecture in service of focused devotion. By the mid-13th century, the shrine of St. Thomas Becket had become one of the wonders of the Christian world. Pilgrims who had travelled to Jerusalem, Rome and Santiago de Compostela declared Canterbury's shrine superior, or at least shinier. It was a tourist destination, a religious site and a political statement, all wrapped in enough precious metal to fund a small war. The success bred imitators but no equals. Other saints' custodians looked at Canterbury's profits and tried to upgrade their own shrines. But Thomas had the perfect combination: political martyrdom, royal connections, convenient location and excellent marketing. His shrine didn't just shimmer with gems, it glowed with the kind of success that made other saints' promoters consider career changes. The shrine stood for 3 centuries, growing ever more elaborate as grateful pilgrims added their offerings. Each generation found new ways to honour the saint, new gems to add, new decorations to commission. It became less a monument and more an accretion of devotion, wealth and artistic ambition. It was medieval Christianity at its most material and most spiritual, proving that the two weren't mutually exclusive. But such concentration of wealth and symbolism couldn't last forever. Shrines, like the saints they housed, were subject to the winds of political change, and in England, those winds were about to shift dramatically, bringing a king who would view Becket's shrine not as a monument to sanctity, but as a challenge to royal authority that had stood far too long. 300 years after Thomas Becket's murder, another Henry sat on the English throne, and this one had even less patience for troublesome priests, dead or alive. Henry VIII, a king who collected wives like playing cards and discarded them with similar ease, had decided that England's relationship with Rome needed updating, specifically to the "it's not you, it's me, actually it's definitely you" status. The break with Rome in the 1530s transformed many things in England, but for Thomas Becket's cult, it was catastrophic in the most literal sense. Here was a saint who represented everything Henry VIII despised: papal authority over royal will, ecclesiastical independence from secular control, and most annoyingly the principle that kings could be wrong. Thomas had to go, and this time he needed to stay gone. The campaign against Becket began subtly, which for Henry VIII meant only moderately violent. Royal agents started questioning the authenticity of miracles attributed to the saint. Investigations were launched into financial irregularities at Canterbury because nothing undermined sanctity quite like dodgy bookkeeping. Sermons were preached, suggesting that perhaps Thomas hadn't been a saint but a traitor, which required impressive theological gymnastics. But Henry, never one for half measures when full measures were available, decided that propaganda wasn't enough. In 1538, he issued a proclamation that would have made the original Henry's knights whistle with appreciation. Thomas Becket was to be tried for treason. The fact that he'd been dead for 368 years was deemed irrelevant. Medieval justice had always been flexible, and Tudor justice was positively gymnastic. The trial of a centuries-dead archbishop was the kind of legal theatre that only absolute monarchy could produce. Thomas was accused of rebellion against Henry II, disturbing the realm and general troublemaking. The defence, such as it was, consisted of empty air and the occasional miraculous healing that everyone agreed to ignore. The prosecution, armed with royal authority and creative historical interpretation, was decidedly more substantial. The verdict was never in doubt. Thomas Becket was found guilty of treason, stripped of his sainthood, and condemned to have his shrine destroyed. It was perhaps the most thorough character assassination in English history, made more impressive by the victim's inability to respond, except through reported miracles, which were now illegal. The destruction of the shrine began in September 1538, supervised by royal commissioners who combined governmental efficiency with iconoclastic enthusiasm. The first challenge was simply accessing the wealth. 3 centuries of offerings had created layers of precious metals and gems that required careful extraction. It was archaeology in reverse, destroying history to harvest its valuable bits. The commissioners kept meticulous records because even sacred destruction required proper documentation. The inventory reads like a dragon's hoard crossed with a jewellery catalogue. Gold by the hundredweight, silver by the ton, gems that required special vocabulary to describe. The regale of France, that ruby the size of a hen's egg, went straight to Henry's personal collection, where it would eventually decorate on a thumb ring, because subtlety was not a Tudor virtue. Regor autour. The physical destruction was methodical. The wooden structure was dismantled piece by piece. The gold and silver plates were pried off and melted down. The gems were extracted with the care of dentists removing teeth from a very wealthy mouth. Everything valuable was preserved for the royal treasury. Everything else was destroyed with prejudice. The bones of Thomas Becket himself received special treatment. Royal propaganda claimed they were burned and the ashes scattered, eliminating any possibility of future veneration. The monks of Canterbury, displaying the kind of creative record-keeping that medieval institutions excelled at, may have hidden some remains. Several locations later claimed to have authentic Becket bones, suggesting either miraculous multiplication or strategic misdirection. The theological destruction was equally thorough. Thomas's feast days were abolished, his name was removed from all liturgical calendars, churches dedicated to him were rededicated to less troublesome saints, images of his martyrdom were defaced or destroyed. It was attempted historical erasure on a massive scale, cancel culture with royal authority and hammers. The financial windfall was staggering. Conservative estimates suggest the shrine's destruction netted the crown over £300,000 sterling, 0 pence, a sum that could fund wars or wives, both of which Henry needed in quantity. The wealth that generations of pilgrims had offered to secure divine favour now secured temporal power. It was recycling with a vengeance. The impact on Canterbury was devastating. The city's economy, based largely on pilgrimage, collapsed overnight. Inns closed, souvenir sellers went bankrupt, and miracle workers found themselves unemployed. The cathedral itself, stripped of its main attraction, seemed suddenly overlarge and purposeless. It was urban renewal in reverse, prosperity demolished by royal decree. The reaction across England was mixed and muted. Open protest was dangerous when the king had demonstrated his willingness to execute wives, ministers, and anyone else who annoyed him. Some genuinely supported the destruction, seeing it as overdue correction of papal overreach. Others mourned privately, hiding their Becket badges and whispering prayers to a saint who officially no longer existed. Internationally, the destruction caused outrage tempered by distance. The Pope condemned it, but papal condemnation had lost its sting when Henry had already broken from Rome. Other Catholic monarchs expressed horror while secretly calculating whether similar shrine robbing might solve their own financial difficulties. The Holy Roman Emperor made disapproving noises while being grateful Henry was focused on internal destruction rather than external expansion. The propagandists worked overtime to justify the destruction. Pamphlets explained how Thomas had never been a real saint, just a traitor with good publicity. His miracles were reinterpreted as coincidences or frauds. His martyrdom was recast as just deserts for defying legitimate royal authority. It was historical revision with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. But erasing 3 centuries of devotion proved harder than destroying physical shrines. People continued to remember Thomas Becket, even if they couldn't mention him publicly. Pilgrim routes became pleasant walks that happened to pass through Canterbury. Miracles still occurred, but were attributed to general divine providence rather than specific saintly intervention. The cult went underground, which in England's damp climate was appropriate. The cathedral tried to adapt to its new reality. Other saints were promoted, but none had Thomas's combination of political drama and miraculous reliability. The building itself, designed to showcase the now absent shrine, seemed architecturally bereft. It was like a theatre after the star had not just left, but been officially declared never to have existed. Henry VIII lived another 9 years after destroying Becket's shrine, growing larger and more tyrannical with each passing year. He never showed remorse for eliminating England's most popular saint, viewing it as necessary housecleaning. When he died in 1547, some whispered it was Becket's revenge, though they whispered very quietly and only to trusted friends. The attempts to restore Becket's cult during the brief Catholic restoration under Mary I 1553-1558 failed to gain traction. Too much had been destroyed, too much wealth redistributed, too many people had adjusted to the new reality. When Elizabeth I established the Protestant settlement, Thomas Becket remained firmly in the category of saints we don't talk about. The destruction was so thorough that by the 17th century, many English people had forgotten why Canterbury Cathedral had been important. The shrine that had shimmered with gems became a memory, then a legend, then a footnote in history books. Thomas Becket, who had fought so hard for ecclesiastical independence, had been defeated by a king who recognised no independence but his own. Yet the very thoroughness of the destruction created its own form of remembrance. The empty space where the shrine had stood became a different kind of monument. Visitors to Canterbury could see exactly where sanctity had been converted to currency, where faith had been melted down for fiscal purposes. It was negative space that spoke volumes. The story of the shrine's destruction became part of Becket's legend, adding a coda to his martyrdom. He had been killed for defying one Henry and erased for embarrassing another. It was symmetry of a sort, proving that in England, challenging royal authority was dangerous, whether you were alive, dead, or somewhere in between. By the time the dust settled on Henry VIII's enthusiastic renovation of English Christianity, Thomas Becket had been officially dead for nearly 4 centuries, and officially non-existent for several decades. Yet despite royal proclamations, theological revisions, and the thorough redistribution of his shrine's wealth, the troublesome priest refused to fully disappear. Like a dinner guest who won't take hints, Becket lingered in the margins of English consciousness. The physical traces were largely gone. Where pilgrims once walked, Protestant travellers now journeyed for purely secular reasons, definitely not stopping at significant spots along the way to think meaningful thoughts. The cathedral at Canterbury stood like a mansion after foreclosure, structurally sound but missing its purpose. Tourists came to admire the architecture, carefully not mentioning the archbishop-shaped hole in its history, but memory proved more durable than metal. In quiet corners of England, particularly in the north, where royal authority arrived late and left early, people remembered. Catholic families passed down stories like heirlooms, each generation adding polish while maintaining the essential structure. Thomas Becket became a whispered tradition, a saint for those who preferred their religion, with a side of civil disobedience. The legends grew in the telling. Becket's blood, already miraculously abundant when he was an official saint, became even more so in underground tradition. Secret relics multiplied like theological rabbits. Fragments of vestment, splinters of shrine wood, vials of diluted blood, all circulated in the Catholic underground, their authenticity inversely proportional to their abundance. Ghost stories emerged because medieval saints made excellent spectral material. Becket was reported walking Canterbury's cloisters, looking for his shrine and finding only gift shops. Witnesses claimed to see him in the cathedral at night, a translucent figure in archiepiscopal robes, carrying his head at various angles depending on the dramatic needs of the story. He was said to appear to those in special need, though his interventions were necessarily subtle in a Protestant nation. The scholarly world found Becket irresistible, despite his official non-existence. Historians, those professional rebels against official narratives, kept his story alive through academic discourse. They wrote careful analyses that managed to discuss a non-saint without endorsing his non-sanctity. Universities, those traditional homes of subversive thinking, preserved manuscripts and documents that just happened to detail the life of England's most successfully difficult archbishop. Literature embraced Becket with the enthusiasm of writers who recognized good material. The story had everything: friendship betrayed, principles maintained unto death, and enough dramatic irony to stock a theatre company. Plays were written that carefully portrayed historical events, without suggesting anyone had been saintly. Poems circulated that remembered a certain archbishop without naming names. It was cultural preservation through plausible deniability. The Victorian era, with its love of medieval romanticism and moral instruction, rediscovered Becket with enthusiasm. He fit perfectly into their narrative preferences, a man of principle standing against authority, suffering for his beliefs, and providing excellent material for stained glass windows. Churches that couldn't officially venerate him could at least include him in historical scenes, usually looking noble and definitely not performing miracles. The Anglo-Catholic movement of the 19th century found in Becket a perfect symbol. Here was proof that the English Church had ancient roots in defying state interference, even if the state was now interfering on their behalf, they carefully threading the needle between celebrating Becket's principles and not quite calling him Saint Thomas. Archaeological investigations at Canterbury revealed the extent of the shrine's destruction and, inadvertently, its former glory. The empty space where the shrine had stood became itself a point of interest. Tourists stood where pilgrims had knelt, imagining wealth they couldn't see and devotion they weren't supposed to feel. The absence became a presence, negative space with positive impact. The 20th century brought new perspectives on the Becket story. Psychohistorians analysed the Henry-Thomas relationship with modern understanding of personality conflicts. Marxist historians saw class struggle in the merchant's son confronting aristocratic power. Feminist scholars noted the entirely masculine nature of the conflict, suggesting things might have gone differently with better communication skills. T.S. Eliot's Murder in the Cathedral brought Becket to modern audiences, transforming medieval martyrdom into modernist meditation. The play, first performed in Canterbury Cathedral itself, gave Thomas philosophical depth and poetic language he'd probably never possessed. It was historical fiction that felt more true than history, capturing the essence if not the exact events. The post-war period saw Becket become an ecumenical figure. Catholics could celebrate their martyr, Anglicans could acknowledge their history, and everyone could agree that murdering archbishops in cathedrals was generally inadvisable. Canterbury Cathedral began cautiously acknowledging its famous ghost, installing modest markers and carefully worded explanations. Tourism replaced pilgrimage as Canterbury's economic engine, but the patterns remained surprisingly similar. Visitors still walked the ancient routes, bought overpriced souvenirs, and sought something transcendent in stone and story. They came for history rather than healing, but many reported feeling moved by something they couldn't quite name. The genius loci persisted despite official discouragement. Modern Canterbury Cathedral handles its complicated heritage with typical Anglican compromise. Becket is remembered but not venerated, celebrated but not sanctified. The site of his martyrdom is marked but not made a shrine. Gift shops sell Becket merchandise that carefully avoids hagiography. Its historical commemoration with theological hedge trimming. Serenity has much more publicity. Martin Hedge. The Catholic Church, freed from English governmental oversight, restored Becket to their calendar of saints. He rejoined the Celestial Company, from which Henry VIII had attempted to expel him, presumably comparing notes with other martyred bishops about difficult monarchs. His feast day is celebrated wherever Catholics gather, though most elaborately in places Henry VIII never reached. Academic conferences regularly convene to discuss Becket, producing papers with titles that would have baffled both Thomas and Henry. The Archbishop, who struggled with ecclesiastical independence, becomes a case study in institutional autonomy. His martyrdom illustrates theories about violence and sacred space. His cult demonstrates patterns of popular devotion versus official religion. He's been thoroughly analysed, contextualised and theorised, which he probably would have found both flattering and incomprehensible. The essential story remains compelling despite, or perhaps because of, its layers of interpretation. Two powerful men, once friends, destroyed each other over principles that seemed worth dying for. One died immediately, dramatically, creating a splash that rippled through centuries. The other died slowly, haunted by consequences he never intended. Both became symbols larger than their historical selves. In the 21st century, Becket survives in cultural memory as the ultimate example of speaking truth to power, even when power has sharp swords and flexible morals. He's invoked by anyone opposing authority, claimed by anyone defending institutional independence, and remembered by anyone who appreciates the dramatic possibilities of cathedral architecture. The echo remains, bouncing off Canterbury stones, reverberating through English history. Thomas Becket, merchant son, royal chancellor, defiant archbishop, murdered saint, destroyed shrine, persistent memory. He encompasses the full journey from ambition through martyrdom to myth. He proved that some figures are too useful to forget, too dramatic to ignore, too embedded in cultural consciousness to fully erase. Every year, thousands visit Canterbury Cathedral. They stand where Thomas died, photographing stones worn smooth by medieval knees and modern feet. They buy guidebooks explaining the historical significance, postcards showing artistic interpretations, and small Canterbury badges that echo medieval pilgrim tokens. They're not pilgrims, officially, but they follow pilgrim paths and purchase pilgrim souvenirs. The murder site is marked now with a modern sculpture, abstract enough to avoid theological commitment, but evocative enough to inspire contemplation. Visitors pause there, reading information panels that explain without endorsing, describe without venerating. Many report feeling something, call it historical weight, architectural atmosphere, or residual sanctity, depending on your perspective. And perhaps, on certain December nights when the cathedral is closed and the city sleeps, something stirs in the shadows. Not a ghost, necessarily, but a memory so strong it takes shape. A figure in archiepiscopal robes, walking familiar stones, checking on his cathedral, noting changes with the critical eye of someone who remembers when things were different. He might pause at the spot where his shrine once stood, that monument to excess and devotion that took 3 centuries to build and days to destroy. He might smile at the irony, all that gold and gems scattered, but his story remains. Henry VIII's treasury has long since been spent, but Becket's legend continues, generating interest, if not compound interest. The troublesome priest troubles still, not through miracles or interventions, but through simple persistence. He remains in the stones that absorbed his blood, in the stories that preserve his defiance, in the space where his shrine once shimmered. He's become what perhaps he always was, an idea more than a man, a principle more than a person, a useful symbol for anyone confronting authority. And so Thomas Becket rests, neither fully dead nor fully alive, neither completely forgotten nor entirely remembered. He exists in that peculiar historical limbo reserved for figures too important to ignore, but too complicated to simplify. He's been murdered, martyred, canonized, destroyed, and partially restored. A full journey through the possibilities of posthumous existence. The echo remains, faint but persistent, reminding us that some conflicts outlive their participants, some principles survive their defenders, and some priests remain troublesome long after they've stopped breathing. In Canterbury Cathedral, in scholarly footnotes, in cultural memory, Thomas Becket endures, proof that the most effective way to silence someone might be to avoid murdering them in their own cathedral. Good night, Thomas. Your body is dust, your shrine is memory, your cult is history, but your echo remains, bouncing through centuries, reminding power that resistance is possible, reminding the resistant that power fights back, reminding everyone that cathedral floors are best kept free of archiepiscopal blood. Sleep well, you troublesome priest. You've earned your rest, even if you seem reluctant to take it. Your story is told, retold, analysed, dramatised and commercialised. You've become what you perhaps never intended, eternal not through sanctity, but through sheer narrative usefulness. You've won the ultimate victory. You've become unforgettable. And in that unforgetting, in that persistent echo, something of you remains. Not the ambitious young clerk, not the magnificent chancellor, not even the defiant archbishop, but the idea of you, the symbol of you, the useful memory of someone who said no to a king and paid the price. That echo bounces through history, growing fainter but never quite silent, a reminder that some voices carry further dead than alive. Thank you for listening, one last time. May your sleep be deep, your dreams quiet, and your mind at peace.